They thought they were just kidnapping a woman. They didn't know a Navy SEAL was pumping gas 20 feet away. But it wasn't the SEAL who gave them away. It was the dog's desperate bark that echoed across the parking lot. And what happened next, what that warrior did to save 2 innocent lives, will stay with you forever. The desert air hung heavy and still over the small Arizona town of Red Mesa, a place where the interstate cut through endless sand and rock like a scar across ancient skin. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the jagged horizon, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep crimson. It was the kind of sunset that photographers drove hundreds of miles to capture, the kind that made even weary travelers pause and stare. The kind of beauty that felt almost painful to witness when your soul was carrying the weight of too many dark memories. Garrett Reeves wasn't pausing. He was running. Not physically, not yet. But inside his head, inside the tight coil of his chest, he was running from the memories that had followed him home, like shadows that stretched longer, with every mile he drove, with every motel he checked into, with every anonymous diner where he ordered coffee and stared at strangers who would never know his story. Garrett was a Navy SEAL, or had been until 3 weeks ago, when his discharge papers had been signed, sealed, and filed away in some bureaucratic vault in Virginia Beach. 22 years of service. 47 confirmed operations across 4 continents and 36 countries, most of whose names he couldn't say even now, years after the missions were declassified in some Pentagon filing cabinet. 3 Bronze Stars with V device for valor. A Purple Heart he'd never told his mother about because she'd worried enough when he'd enlisted at 18, worried through every deployment, worried through every phone call that started with an apology from a commanding officer, and a Silver Star that sat in a box, somewhere in storage, because looking at it reminded him of Sergeant First Class Marcus Williams, Petty Officer Second Class Jake Chen, and Lieutenant Michael Doc Morrison, the men who hadn't come home from that last operation, the men whose faces still visited him in dreams that felt more like accusations than memories. A body that still worked but complained about it every morning, with aching joints that had been compressed by parachute landings, old wounds that predicted weather better than any meteorologist, and a left knee that had been shattered by shrapnel in Helmand Province and reconstructed with enough titanium that airport metal detectors sang like opera singers when he walked through them. And a mind that wouldn't stop replaying the last mission. The mission that had gone wrong in ways that kept him awake at night, staring at water-stained motel ceilings, counting his breaths to keep the panic attacks at bay, reminding himself that the explosions were in the past, that the screaming was memory, that he was safe, he was home, he was alive when better men weren't. That mission in Yemen. The one that wasn't supposed to happen, that wasn't officially sanctioned, that didn't appear in any after-action report. The intelligence had been good, a high-value target, a terrorist financier responsible for 3 embassy bombings and the deaths of 14 Americans holed up in a compound in the mountains. Quick in and out, minimal resistance expected. They'd done 100 missions just like it, except the intelligence hadn't been good. It had been a setup. They'd walked into an ambush that had been planned with military precision, that had used their own tactics against them, that had turned a simple snatch and grab into a running firefight through hostile territory that lasted 9 hours and cost 3 American lives. Garrett had brought his team home, most of them anyway. He'd carried Williams out of that compound on his back, while bullets tore through the air around them. He'd applied the tourniquet that saved Chen's life when an IED had taken his legs. He'd held Morrison while he bled out from a sucking chest wound, promising him that he wasn't going to die, lying through his teeth because Morrison needed to hear it, needed to believe it in those final minutes. The Navy had given Garrett a Silver Star for actions above and beyond the call of duty. Garrett had given himself nightmares and survivor's guilt that felt like a physical weight sitting on his chest every morning when he woke up, and so he'd retired. Not because he was broken. The psych evaluation said he was fit for duty, said his trauma responses were within normal parameters, said he could go back to the teams, but because he didn't trust himself anymore. Didn't trust his judgment. Didn't trust that he wouldn't freeze at the wrong moment, wouldn't hesitate when hesitation meant death for someone under his command. So he'd signed the papers, packed up his life into his truck, and started driving. West generally, though the direction didn't really matter. He was looking for something he couldn't name: peace, maybe, or purpose, or some way to live with the memories that wouldn't let him go. Maverick had come with him, of course. The Navy had wanted to keep the dog, to pair him with a new handler, to keep him working because he was only 8 years old and military working dogs could serve until they were 10 or 11. But Garrett had fought that battle with every ounce of stubbornness and bureaucratic know-how he'd accumulated over 2 decades of military service. He'd filled out forms, he'd called in favors. He'd contacted congressmen and senators and anyone else who might listen, because Maverick wasn't just a military asset. He was family. He was pack. And you didn't abandon family just because the paperwork said it was convenient. 3 weeks later, the adoption papers had come through. Maverick was officially retired, officially Garrett's, officially free to drive across America in the passenger seat of a beat-up Ford truck, searching for whatever it was that came after war. He sat in his truck, a battered but reliable Ford F-150, whose odometer had rolled past 200,000 miles at a gas station on the edge of Red Mesa. The place was called Desert Stop, a sun-bleached oasis of flickering neon signs, dusty pumps, and a convenience store with bars on the windows. The kind of place that had seen better decades. A hand-painted sign advertised coffee for $1.50 and lottery tickets. The asphalt was cracked and patched, creating a mosaic of repair that told the story of decades of desert heat and sparse maintenance. It was the kind of place where truckers grabbed coffee at 3 in the morning and families made reluctant bathroom stops on long road trips, where the bathroom key was attached to a hubcap to prevent theft, and the cashier kept a baseball bat under the counter. Garrett's hands rested on the steering wheel, his knuckles scarred and thick from years of climbing ropes, breaching doors, and hand-to-hand combat training that had become as natural as breathing. His face was weathered, tanned from years under hostile suns in places whose names were still classified, with crow's feet that spoke of squinting through desert glare and laugh lines that hadn't been used much lately. His short-cropped hair was more salt than pepper now, and his gray-green eyes held a 1,000-yard stare that never quite went away. It was the look of a man who had seen things, done things, survived things that most people couldn't imagine even in their darkest nightmares. The counselor at the VA had called it hypervigilance. Garrett called it staying alive. Beside him in the passenger seat sat his constant companion, his anchor to this world, the one being who understood him without words, Maverick. Maverick was a Belgian Malinois, lean and muscular, with a fawn-colored coat and a black mask that made him look perpetually serious. At 85 pounds, he was all coiled energy and intelligence, his amber eyes constantly scanning, assessing, cataloging threats, even when he appeared to be resting. He had been Garrett's partner for 6 years in the teams, a military working dog trained in explosives detection, apprehension, and tactical support. They had deployed together to Afghanistan twice, to Iraq once, and to places that didn't officially exist on any military roster. Maverick had found 17 IEDs that would have killed American soldiers. He had taken down 3 enemy combatants attempting to breach their compound. He had been wounded twice, once by shrapnel, once by a ricochet, and had kept working through both injuries until Garrett had physically restrained him and carried him to the medic. When Garrett retired, Maverick came with him. It wasn't negotiable. The Navy had tried to reassign the dog to a new handler, but Garrett had filled out every form, made every phone call, and pulled every favor owed to him until the paperwork came through. They were a bonded pair, two warriors trying to figure out what peace looked like, two souls who had seen the worst of humanity and were now searching for evidence of the best. "Come on, boy," Garrett said, his voice a low rumble that carried the gravel of too many years, shouting commands over gunfire and helicopter rotors. He stepped out of the truck, the desert heat hitting him like a physical wall. The temperature gauge at the gas station read 104 degrees, but it felt hotter, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned metal surfaces into branding irons. Maverick hopped down beside him, immediately going into a loose heel position, his nose twitching as he processed the cacophony of scents. Gasoline, hot asphalt, old French fries, motor oil, stale beer from a broken bottle in the trash, the sharp tang of antifreeze, and dozens of human trails crisscrossing the parking lot, like an invisible map that only his superior senses could read. Garrett began pumping gas, the numbers on the digital display rolling slowly upward with an electronic beep for each dollar. He scanned the area with the automatic efficiency of a man whose survival had once depended on reading environments, whose training had taught him to never let his guard down, to always know his exits, to always identify potential threats before they became kinetic problems. 2 pumps over, a young couple in a minivan wrestled with a screaming toddler, their faces tight with the exhaustion of a long road trip. At the convenience store entrance, a trucker in a faded Peterbilt cap emerged with a coffee and a pack of cigarettes, his gait suggesting back problems from too many hours behind the wheel. Across the lot, near the air pump, a homeless man sat with his back against the wall, a cardboard sign propped beside him that read, "Veteran Anything Helps God Bless." His face was weathered beyond his years, his eyes hollow with a pain that Garrett recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror on bad mornings. Garrett made a mental note to drop some cash with the cashier on his way out, asking them to pass it along. He'd been where that man was, emotionally, if not physically. He knew how thin the line was between functioning and falling apart. It all seemed normal, painfully, blissfully normal. The kind of mundane Tuesday evening scene that people took for granted, that they complained about when they had to stop and deal with it, never realizing how precious normal was until it was ripped away. That was when the white panel van pulled in. It was a Ford Transit, newer model, maybe 2 or 3 years old, commercial grade, with no windows in the back and no company logo on the side. The paint was clean, recently washed, which immediately registered as unusual in Garrett's tactical mind. Commercial vehicles in the desert accumulated dust like a badge of honor, and any contractor or delivery service would have their branding visible. The kind of vehicle that could belong to a contractor, a delivery service, or someone who didn't want people seeing what they were hauling. It parked at the far end of the lot, away from the pumps, away from the overhead lights, near the dumpsters where the shadows were deepest and where the burned-out light fixtures created a convenient blind spot. Garrett noticed it because noticing things was what kept you alive. But he didn't register it as a threat. Not yet. It was just data, filed away in the tactical computer of his mind, cataloged and assessed on a subconscious level that never stopped running threat assessments. The gas pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Garrett replaced the nozzle, screwed the cap back on with careful precision, and was reaching for his truck door when he heard it. A bark. High-pitched, desperate, muffled by distance and the ambient noise of the gas station, but unmistakable in its urgency. Maverick's head snapped toward the sound, his entire body going rigid in a way that Garrett had seen hundreds of times in the field. A low growl, barely audible, vibrated from his chest, not a sound of aggression, but a warning, a signal that something was fundamentally wrong in a way that transcended language. Garrett froze, his hand still on the truck door handle. He knew that stance. That was Maverick's threat, alert something was wrong, something was very, very wrong. In 6 years of working together, that growl had never been wrong. It had saved Garrett's life in Kandahar when Maverick had sensed an ambush 3 seconds before it was sprung. It had warned him of an IED in Ramadi that the metal detectors had missed. It was the growl that meant danger was present, imminent, and required immediate action. He followed Maverick's gaze across the parking lot to the white van. The back doors were open now, swung wide, and 2 men stood beside it, arguing in low, tense voices that carried the cadence of criminals who knew they were working against a clock. They wore street clothes, one in a black hoodie. Despite the 100-degree heat, the hood pulled up to shadow his face, the other in a grimy tank top that showed off prison tattoos running up his arms in the distinctive style of gang ink. Both had the wiry, dangerous look of men who had spent time on the wrong side of the law, who moved with the coiled tension of violence always just beneath the surface. Garrett's trained eye caught the bulges at their waistbands, both armed, and the way they kept glancing around, checking sight lines, looking for witnesses. And between them, struggling violently with every ounce of strength in her body, was a woman. She was in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had come partially loose in the struggle, wearing yoga pants and a torn t-shirt that had once been white but was now stained with dirt and what looked like blood at the collar. Her hands were bound in front of her with heavy-duty zip ties, the kind that law enforcement used, the kind that cut into flesh and left bruises. A strip of duct tape covered her mouth, wrapped around her head twice for redundancy, muffling her screams into desperate, inarticulate sounds. Her eyes were wide with terror, whites showing all around the irises, tears streaming down her face as she thrashed and kicked, fighting with everything she had, her body language screaming the desperate knowledge that if she stopped fighting, she would die. But what made Garrett's blood run cold? What made the tactical computer in his mind immediately escalate this from suspicious activity to active threat requiring immediate intervention was what he saw in the van behind her. A small golden retriever, maybe 2 years old, barely more than a puppy, was tied to the interior wall of the van with a rope around its neck. The rope was too short, giving the dog maybe 2 feet of movement, and it was already pulled taut as the dog strained against it. The dog was barking frantically, pulling against the restraint with such force that it was choking itself, its paws scrabbling on the metal floor of the van, desperate for purchase, trying to get to the woman, trying to protect her. Its loyalty was overriding its fear, overriding its survival instinct, overriding everything except the need to save the person it loved. "No, no, no, please, no." The woman's muffled voice was barely audible through the tape and the distance, her words garbled, but the desperation in them was universal, transcendent, the sound that every human being makes when facing their own mortality. Hoodie grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back with casual brutality, exposing her throat in a way that made Garrett's hand instinctively move toward his weapon. "Shut up, or I'll shut you up permanent," he snarled, his voice carrying the flat effect of a man who had made that threat before and followed through on it. Tank Top looked around nervously, his eyes darting from the convenience store to the road to the other cars, calculating risk. "Hurry up, get her in. Someone's gonna see." His voice had the higher pitch of fear, of a man who was in over his head but too committed to back out now. They were going to put her in the van. They were going to close those doors, and once those doors closed, Garrett knew with absolute certainty, with the same certainty that had kept him alive through 22 years of combat operations, that woman and her dog would never be seen alive again. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a carjacking. This was an abduction by professionals who had done this before, who had a system, who had a place to take her where no one would hear her scream. The world narrowed. The sounds of the gas station, the hum of traffic on the interstate, the tinny music from the convenience store speakers playing an old country song about heartbreak, the hiss of air brakes from a passing truck, the mechanical ding of the gas pump at the next island all faded into a muted background hum. Garrett's vision sharpened, colors becoming more vivid, edges becoming more defined, his pupils dilating as his sympathetic nervous system flooded his body with adrenaline. His breathing slowed and deepened, his heart rate dropping into the controlled zone he'd trained himself to maintain under fire, and that old familiar coldness settled over him like a cloak, like armor, like the mantle of responsibility he'd worn for more than 2 decades. He was no longer a retired SEAL trying to find his place in civilian life, no longer a man running from his memories, no longer a warrior without a war. He was an operator. The mission had found him. And every fiber of his being, every hour of training, every scar on his body, every nightmare that woke him in the dark hours of the morning, all of it had led to this moment. Maverick felt it too. The dog shifted his weight forward, his muscles coiling like springs under his fur, his amber eyes locked on the men by the van with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just watched, a coiled weapon waiting to be released, waiting for the command he knew was coming. Garrett's hand moved to the small of his back, to the concealed carry holster that held his Sig Sauer P320. The weapon was an extension of himself, a tool he'd carried for so many years that drawing it was as natural as breathing. His fingers wrapped around the familiar grip, the texture of the handle fitting perfectly into his palm, the weight of the weapon grounding him, focusing him, reminding him of who he was and what he was capable of when innocent lives hung in the balance. "Maverick," he said quietly, his voice dropping into the command tone that cut through chaos and fear, the tone that had directed fire teams in the worst conditions imaginable, the tone that carried absolute authority and complete calm. "Watch." Maverick's ears pinned forward, every muscle in his body tightening, his breathing becoming shallow and controlled. His amber eyes locked on the men by the van like laser guidance systems. He didn't bark, he didn't whine, he just watched, every sense focused, every instinct engaged, waiting for the word that would release him like a guided missile toward his target. Garrett began walking. Not running would draw attention, would telegraph his intentions, would make him a target, would give them time to react, time to shoot the woman, time to start the van and attempt an escape. He walked with purpose, his stride long and unhurried, but eating up ground with the efficient gait of a man who had learned to cover distance without appearing to rush, closing the gap across the parking lot with the inexorable advance of a force of nature. 30 feet, 25, 20. He was running calculations with every step, his tactical mind processing variables faster than conscious thought. 2 armed hostiles, one with a handgun visible, probably a second weapon on the other. The woman was between him and them. Any gunfire put her at risk. The van's engine was off, they couldn't escape quickly. The nearest cover was the dumpster, 15 feet to his left. Exit routes, back to his truck, into the convenience store, or north toward the highway. Civilian presence. The couple with the toddler had driven away. The trucker was inside. The homeless veteran was out of the line of fire. Good, no collateral damage risk. Tank Top saw him first. His head snapped up, his body language shifting from nervous accomplice to cornered animal in an instant. His hand moved instinctively to his waistband, where a bulge suggested he was carrying. "Hey, man, keep walking. This ain't your business." The words were aggressive, but Garrett heard the fear underneath them. This man was used to people looking away, used to intimidating civilians into compliance through sheer, aggressive presence. Garrett didn't respond. He just kept walking, his eyes locked on Tank Top's hand, on Hoodie's grip on the woman's hair, on the angles of the van, on the position of the dog inside, on the exits, on every variable that mattered in the tactical problem he was solving with each step forward. His face was empty of expression, a mask of professional calm that revealed nothing of the controlled violence coiling inside him. 15 feet. I said, keep walking. Tank Top's voice rose, taking on a shrill edge of panic that told Garrett everything he needed to know. This man was scared, which made him dangerous and unpredictable. He pulled a revolver from his waistband, a snub-nosed .38 that looked like it had seen better days, the bluing worn off in patches, the grip wrapped in electrical tape. He pointed it vaguely in Garrett's direction, his grip sloppy, his stance all wrong, his finger already on the trigger instead of indexed along the frame. His trigger, discipline, non-existent. The hallmark of a man who had held guns but never been trained to use them properly. Garrett stopped, 10 feet away, close enough to engage if needed, far enough to avoid being grabbed. The perfect tactical distance for what came next. "Let her go," Garrett said. His voice was calm, flat, devoid of emotion. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even really a command. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had given thousands of orders and watched them be obeyed because failure to obey meant death. The words carried weight, authority, and the implicit promise of consequences. Hoodie laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the convenience store walls. "Or what, old man? You think you're some kind of hero?" He twisted the woman's hair harder, yanking her head back at a painful angle that made her cry out, even through the tape, tears streaming down her face. "Get lost before you get hurt. This is between us and the lady." Inside the van, the golden retriever's barking reached a frenzied pitch, the rope around its neck cutting into its fur, leaving a raw line where the nylon bit into flesh as it lunged forward with such desperate force that blood began to show through its golden coat, desperate to reach its owner, willing to strangle itself in the attempt to save the woman it loved. Garrett's eyes flicked to the dog for a fraction of a second, and something in his chest tightened. He saw the raw desperation in its eyes, the unbreakable loyalty that made it willing to die trying to save the woman it loved, the same loyalty he'd seen in Maverick's eyes 100 times in 100 different firefights. He understood that loyalty on a level that went deeper than words. He felt it every time he looked at Maverick, every time he remembered the men who had died in his arms, every time he thought about the teammates who hadn't made it home. His gaze returned to Hoodie, and now there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a cold, flat promise that made Hoodie's smile falter just slightly. "Last chance," Garrett said, his voice even quieter now, which somehow made it more menacing. "Let her go. Walk away. You get to live." "You threatening me?" Hoodie's face twisted with rage, the kind of rage that came from a man whose authority was being challenged, whose control was slipping, whose fear was turning into anger because anger felt better than fear. He released the woman's hair and reached behind his back, pulling out a knife. A cheap gas station special with a 4-inch serrated blade and a plastic handle, the kind of weapon that had killed plenty of people despite its humble origins. "I'm gonna cut you up, old man. Gonna teach you to mind your own damn business." The woman stumbled as he released her, falling to her knees on the hot asphalt, her bound hands unable to catch her properly. She looked at Garrett with eyes that held a desperate, fragile, I hope the look of someone who had given up and was now allowing themselves to believe in rescue, even though belief felt dangerous because disappointment might break her completely. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible true stories of courage and loyalty. Garrett's eyes were dead calm, the eyes of a professional facing a familiar situation, the eyes of a man who had been threatened by much more dangerous people in much more dangerous places and was still standing. "Maverick," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Guard." Maverick exploded forward like a bullet from a gun, like a missile launched from a platform, like a force of nature given physical form. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. He was a silent, fawn-colored projectile, aimed with lethal precision, his paws barely seeming to touch the ground as he covered the distance in great bounding strides that ate up the space between them in less than 2 seconds. Tank Top's gun was still pointed vaguely at Garrett. His attention split between the approaching man and his partner with the knife. He never even saw the dog coming, never registered the threat until 85 pounds of trained military working dog hit him like a linebacker, making a tackle, low and hard and with absolutely no mercy. Maverick hit him in the legs, his shoulder driving into Tank Top's knees with the force of a battering ram. The impact was a sound like a car crash in miniature, a meaty thud that echoed across the parking lot. Tank Top's legs buckled, his knees bending the wrong way, his arms windmilled uselessly as he tried to catch his balance, and the revolver flew from his hand, spinning through the air and skittering across the asphalt with a metallic scrape that sent it sliding under a nearby pickup truck. He crashed onto his back, the air exploding from his lungs in a pained whoosh that left him gasping like a fish on dry land, his diaphragm paralyzed by the impact. Before he could even think about getting up, before his stunned brain could process what had just happened, Maverick was on him. The dog's jaws clamped down on Tank Top's forearm, not the gun hand that was already empty and useless, but the other arm that was reaching desperately for a backup weapon tucked into an ankle holster. Maverick's teeth sank through fabric and flesh with a grinding crunch that made Tank Top scream, a high, terrified sound that cut through the evening air like a siren. The scream of a man who had hurt others but had never truly been hurt himself, who was now learning exactly what he had inflicted on his victims. Garrett moved. The whole world moved with him, time seeming to slow down in the way it always did in combat, each second stretching into subjective minutes, giving him all the time he needed to process, to react, to execute the movements that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of training until they were as natural and automatic as his heartbeat. Hoodie, shocked by the sudden explosion of violence, by the speed and precision and utter ruthlessness of the dog's attack, hesitated for a critical half-second. His eyes went wide, his mouth opened in surprise, and in that moment of frozen shock, his brain screaming contradictory commands: fight, flee, protect himself, finish the job, he made the fatal mistake of turning his attention away from Garrett. He turned toward the man approaching him, raising the knife, his face contorting with rage and fear in equal measure, the blade catching the dying sunlight and throwing it back in orange glints. Garrett closed the distance in 2 strides, his movements fluid and economical, no wasted motion, every step perfectly balanced and controlled. His body moved with the muscle memory of 10,000 training sessions, 10,000 repetitions of techniques that had been drilled until they became instinct, until thinking was replaced by doing. His left hand shot out with the speed of a striking snake, grabbing Hoodie's wrist just below the hand holding the knife. His grip was iron, his fingers digging into the cluster of nerves and tendons at the base of Hoodie's hand with surgical precision, pressure applied to the radial nerve, the ulnar nerve, the specific points that made the hand spasm regardless of will or strength, applying pressure to points he'd learned in close-quarters combat training. Pressure that turned muscle into jelly and made bones feel like they were breaking. Hoodie's hand spasmed involuntarily, the nerves firing in confused agony, the tendons refusing to obey his brain's desperate commands to maintain his grip on the weapon, to stab, to fight, to survive. With his right hand moving in perfect synchronization with his left, as if both were controlled by the same impulse, Garrett delivered a short, brutal strike to Hoodie's solar plexus. It wasn't a Hollywood punch with a wide telegraphed wind-up and a satisfying crunch. It wasn't a wild swing powered by rage or adrenaline. It was a palm-heel strike designed by military science, tested through decades of combat experience, refined through the blood and lessons of warriors who had come before a technique designed to incapacitate, to shut down the diaphragm, to interrupt the phrenic nerve signal to the breathing muscles, to make it impossible to breathe or fight or do anything except focus on the desperate need for oxygen. His palm drove into the soft space just below the sternum with all the force of his body weight behind it, driven by legs that could squat 400 pounds and hips that could generate rotational power like a baseball bat, by core muscles that had been trained to transfer force from ground to fist with maximum efficiency, arriving with the focused impact of a sledgehammer hitting a pressure point the size of a quarter. Hoodie's eyes bulged, the pupils dilating in shock and pain. His mouth opened in a soundless gasp that produced nothing but a thin wheeze, his face going pale, and then red, and then purple as his body tried and failed to draw breath, as his diaphragm locked in spasm and refused to function no matter how desperately his brain screamed for air. The knife fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the ground with a metallic ring that sounded like a bell tolling, like the final note of a song that had ended in his defeat. Garrett didn't stop, didn't pause to admire his handiwork or give the man a chance to recover, didn't hesitate or second-guess or do anything that might give his opponent an opening. Hesitation killed. Mercy to an enemy in the moment of combat was cruelty to the innocent they might harm. He pivoted with the grace of a dancer and the efficiency of a killing machine, using Hoodie's momentum against him, using the man's own weight and forward motion, and the physics of leverage to spin him around like a puppet on strings, like a mannequin being repositioned. In one smooth motion that flowed from the strike to the pivot to the finish without pause or break, he drove Hoodie face first into the side of the van. The metallic boom echoed across the parking lot like thunder, like the sound of justice being delivered in the only language violence understood. The whole van rocked on its suspension, the springs compressing and rebounding. A spiderweb crack appeared in the metal where Hoodie's face had impacted, testament to the force of the collision. Hoodie's legs went rubbery. His brain scrambled by the impact, by the sudden violence, by the realization that he had picked a fight with someone who existed in a completely different category of dangerous, and he slumped. Only Garrett's grip on his arm, keeping him upright enough to avoid collapsing completely into a heap on the hot asphalt. Garrett pulled a zip tie from his pocket. Old habits die hard, and he'd started carrying them when he'd started driving across the country, part of a go-bag that also included duct tape in OD green, 50 feet of paracord rated for 750 pounds, a combat medical kit with quick clot and chest seals, 3 MREs, water purification tablets, emergency cash in small bills, and a change of clothes because you never knew when the mission would find you, when you'd need to render aid, when you'd need to secure a threat or mark a trail or survive in the wilderness, and secured Hoodie's hands behind his back with quick, efficient movements. The plastic ratcheted tight with a series of clicks that sounded almost musical, each click a note in the symphony of consequences. He pulled it tighter than was strictly necessary, tight enough that it would cut off circulation in about 20 minutes, tight enough that it would hurt, because some part of him wanted this man to feel discomfort, wanted him to understand, on a visceral level, that actions had consequences. He patted the man down with professional thoroughness, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had conducted hundreds of prisoner searches in dozens of countries, finding a second knife in a boot. Sheath. A cheap folder with a 3-inch blade that looked like it had seen some use, the blade stained with something dark, and a cell phone in his pocket, probably prepaid, probably untraceable, probably full of evidence that would help convict him and his partners. Both items he secured, tucking them into his own pockets for transfer to law enforcement. Only then did he let go, and Hoodie slid down the side of the van like a rag doll, collapsing in a gasping, defeated heap, his face pressed against the hot asphalt that had to be 130 degrees in the direct sunlight, unable to do anything except try desperately to remember how to breathe, how to make his diaphragm work, how to survive the next few seconds. The entire engagement had taken 7 seconds from the moment Maverick had launched himself forward to the moment Hoodie hit the ground. 7 seconds to neutralize 2 armed men and prevent a murder. Garrett turned, his body still coiled and ready, scanning for additional threats. Tank Top was still on the ground, his face pale with shock and pain, his arms still locked in Maverick's jaws. The dog wasn't thrashing or tearing. He wasn't trying to cause maximum damage or kill. He was simply holding, applying steady, unrelenting pressure that kept the man completely immobilized, his amber eyes fixed on the man beneath him with the unwavering focus of a professional doing his job. "Maverick, out," Garrett commanded, his voice carrying calm authority. Instantly, without hesitation, Maverick released his grip and backed away 3 steps, his eyes never leaving Tank Top. His mouth was flecked with blood, the man's blood, not his own. But he stood at perfect attention, ready to re-engage if commanded, ready to protect, ready to do whatever his partner needed him to do. Tank Top clutched his bleeding arm, whimpering, his fight completely gone, replaced by the simpering fear of a man who had just learned he was nowhere near as dangerous as he'd thought he was. The bite wound was deep but not critical. Maverick had been trained to disable, not to kill, unless killing was specifically required. Garrett zip-tied Tank Top's hands behind his back with the same efficient movements, ignoring the man's whimpered pleas for mercy, for a doctor, for help. He patted him down, finding the backup pistol in the ankle holster, a small .22 caliber, basically useless, except at contact distance, and a wallet stuffed with cash that probably wasn't his. Both items went into Garrett's pocket for the police. Then he kicked both the revolver and the knife far out of reach, sending them skittering across the parking lot into the drainage ditch where they couldn't be easily retrieved. Only then, with both threats neutralized and secured, did he allow himself to breathe. He pulled out his phone, dialed 911, and spoke in a clipped, professional tone that carried no emotion, just facts. "This is Garrett Reeves at the Desert Stop on Route 60, mile marker 237. I have 2 armed suspects in custody. 1 attempted kidnapping in progress, attempted abduction with intent. Victim is female, mid-20s, bound and gagged. Send police and ambulance. Suspects are secured and non-combative. 1 suspect has a dog bite to the right forearm, needs medical attention but is stable. No shots fired. Repeat. No shots fired. Scene is secure." He hung up before the dispatcher could ask the inevitable questions, could try to keep him on the line, could waste time that the woman didn't have. He'd give a full statement when the police arrived, would answer every question they asked, would cooperate fully with the investigation because that's what you did when you were a civilian, when you weren't operating under military authority, when you needed the system to work. But first, he needed to take care of the victim. Then, and only then, did he turn to the woman. She was still on her knees where she'd fallen during the next time. Struggle, her back pressed against the van's rear tire, her eyes wide with shock, her whole body trembling violently. Tears streamed down her face, her breathing coming in short, panicked gasps through her nose that spoke of approaching hyperventilation. Her wrists were red and raw where the zip ties had cut into them, small lines of blood showing through. She was staring at him with an expression that mixed terror, disbelief, hope, and a dozen other emotions that flickered across her face too quickly to name. Garrett approached slowly, deliberately, his movements careful and non-threatening. He kept his hands visible, made himself as small as he could for a man his size, tried to project calm and safety instead of the violence he'd just deployed. He knelt down to her level, putting himself at a psychological disadvantage, making himself vulnerable, trying to be less intimidating. His voice shifted from the command tone to something softer, gentler, the voice he'd used with frightened children in Afghan villages, the voice that promised safety and meant it. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his gray-green eyes meeting hers with steady compassion. "You're safe now. My name is Garrett. I'm going to remove the tape, okay? It's going to hurt for a second, but then you'll be able to breathe better. Is that okay?" She nodded frantically, desperately. Her eyes locked on his, searching his face for any sign that this was a trick, that he was another threat, that her nightmare wasn't over. But whatever she saw there, the steady calm, the genuine concern, the warrior's promise of protection, seemed to reassure her because some of the wild panic in her eyes subsided, replaced by exhausted trust. Garrett reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements, giving her time to see his hands coming, to process that he wasn't going to hurt her. He found the edge of the duct tape where it was secured behind her head and, in one quick, decisive motion, ripped it off. The sound was ugly. The woman's skin came away red and inflamed. But it was done. She gasped, a huge shuddering breath that seemed to fill her entire body, and then the sobs came, deep and wrenching and primal, the kind of sobs that came from a place of pure terror and overwhelming relief. The kind of crying that was a release of pressure that had been building inside her like steam in a boiler. Her whole body shook with it. "You're okay," Garrett said, his voice steady and calm, an anchor in the storm of her emotion. "You're safe. They can't hurt you. I've got you." My dog," she gasped between sobs, her voice raw and hoarse, her throat damaged from screaming against the tape. "Bailey. They grabbed me outside my house. I was just taking Bailey for a walk in my neighborhood. They put a bag over my head. I thought they were going to." Her voice broke completely, dissolving into incoherent sounds of grief and terror. "Bailey's right here," Garrett said gently. He stood, smoothly, and moved to the van's open back doors. The golden retriever was still tied to the wall, but it had stopped barking now that the immediate threat was over. It was whining instead, a high, desperate sound that tugged at something deep in Garrett's chest, its tail wagging tentatively despite its fear, its whole body trembling as Garrett approached. "Easy, buddy," Garrett murmured, his voice taking on the special tone he reserved for frightened animals. He pulled out his folding knife, a well-used Benchmade that had been with him for 10 years, and carefully, gently cut the rope around Bailey's neck. The moment the pressure released, the dog took a huge, gasping breath, its pink tongue lolling, blood visible where the rope had cut into its skin. But the dog barely seemed to notice its own injury. The moment Bailey was free, he launched himself out of the van with the desperate energy of a prisoner escaping captivity, scrambling across the hot pavement with his claws clicking on the asphalt, making a beeline for the woman. She threw her bound hands around the dog's neck, burying her face in his fur, and they both collapsed into a heap of tears and golden fur and desperate, joyful reunion. The dog whined and licked her face, his tail wagging so hard his whole back end shook, pressing himself against her as if he could merge his body with hers, keep her safe through sheer proximity and force of love. Garrett pulled his knife again and carefully cut the zip ties, binding her wrists, the plastic parting with a snap. Red marks and cuts showed where the ties had bitten deep. She'd need those cleaned and bandaged, probably needed to be checked for other injuries he couldn't see. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked gently, giving her space, giving her time to process. "Claire," she said, her voice muffled against Bailey's fur, her hands running over the dog's body again and again, as if she needed to confirm he was real, he was okay. They had both survived. "Claire." "Morrison." "Okay, Claire, the police are on their way. You're going to be okay. You're both going to be okay." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and dirt and smeared makeup, her eyes red and swollen from crying, her hair a mess, her shirt torn. But she was alive. She was breathing. She was here. You saved us," she whispered, her voice breaking again. I thought we were dead. I thought." Her voice dissolved into tears again, and she couldn't finish the sentence. "You're not dead," Garrett said simply, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. "You're right here. You're alive. You're safe. And you're strong. You fought them. That's why you're still here." Maverick, who had been holding his position like the disciplined operator he was, padded over now that Garrett had given him an unspoken release. He approached Claire and Bailey cautiously, his body language calm and non-threatening, despite the blood still on his muzzle, his tail giving a gentle wag. Bailey, still trembling, sniffed Maverick tentatively with the universal canine greeting ritual, and then, in the mysterious language that only dogs speak, gave him a single tail wag of gratitude, of recognition, of acknowledgement that this warrior had helped save them both. Maverick sat down beside them, his presence solid and reassuring, a guardian standing watch. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing steadily louder, converging on their location from multiple directions, multiple units responding to the kidnapping call, which meant this was being taken seriously, which meant help was truly coming. Garrett stood, his body still in tactical mode, despite the threat being neutralized, scanning the parking lot with professional thoroughness. The young couple with the toddler had seen something, probably the violence, probably Maverick taking down Tank Top, and had driven away quickly, which was smart, which was what civilians should do when violence erupted. The trucker was standing by his rig now, his phone out, probably recording everything, which would actually help corroborate Garrett's statement. The homeless veteran was gone, vanished like smoke, which was also smart. People on the margins learned early to avoid anything that might bring police attention. The scene was secure. The mission, such as it was complete. Now came the aftermath, the statements, the bureaucracy, the system working the way it was supposed to work when everything went right. 2 Navajo County Sheriff's cruisers screeched into the parking lot, their tires squealing on the hot asphalt, their lights painting the scene in strobing red and blue that made everything look surreal, like a scene from a movie. 4 deputies piled out in a tactical stack, their hands on their weapons, but not drawn. Good discipline, good training, their faces tense with the adrenaline of responding to a violent felony in progress. "Hands where I can see them." The lead deputy shouted, his voice carrying command authority. His weapon was drawn now, held in a low, ready position, his eyes scanning the scene, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Garrett raised his hands slowly, carefully, his movements calm and deliberate, showing that he wasn't a threat, that he was cooperating, that he understood protocol. "I'm the one who called it in," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "The suspects are over there, secured with zip ties. The victim is here with me, safe and uninjured, except for minor abrasions. My sidearm is concealed carry, small of my back, Sig Sauer P320, Arizona CCW permit in my wallet, right rear pocket. I'm a retired Navy SEAL." I intervened to stop an in-progress kidnapping. I used appropriate force to neutralize the threat. The lead deputy, a wiry man in his 50s with weathered brown skin and sharp, intelligent eyes, with sergeant's stripes on his sleeve and a name tag that read Ortiz, approached cautiously. His eyes took in the scene with the practiced assessment of a veteran law enforcement officer. The two zip-tied men on the ground, one bleeding from a dog bite and whimpering, the other gasping against the side of the van, the woman sitting with her dog, Maverick standing at a perfect heel beside Garrett, the evidence of violent but controlled force, the complete absence of weapons in the immediate vicinity except for Garrett's legally carried concealed pistol. "Sergeant Ortiz?" the deputy said, lowering his weapon slightly but not holstering it, still maintaining tactical awareness. His voice was firm but not hostile. "You, Garrett Reeves?" "Yes, sir." "You former military?" It wasn't really a question. Ortiz could clearly see the bearing, the discipline, the way Garrett stood and moved and controlled the situation. "Navy, 22 years. SEAL teams." Ortiz nodded slowly, his eyes flicking to Maverick, taking in the military working dog stance, the blood on the muzzle, the absolute discipline and control. "That a military working dog?" "Was. He's retired with me. 6 years in the teams. Explosives, detection, and apprehension." "He bite one of these scumbags?" "Yes, sir. Necessary force to prevent the use of a firearm against me." The suspect was armed with a .38 revolver, pointed it at me, and my partner engaged to neutralize the threat. "The bite is not life-threatening." Ortiz holstered his weapon and motioned for his deputies to secure the suspects. "Medical first, then custody," he ordered. "Martinez, get statements from the victim." "Chen, process the scene. I want photos of everything before we move anything." "Rodriguez, check that van for additional weapons or contraband." The deputies moved with professional efficiency, each knowing their role. One approached Claire carefully, speaking in gentle tones while calling for the ambulance that was already pulling in. Another began photographing the scene with a digital camera. The third approached the van cautiously, flashlight in hand. Ortiz turned back to Garrett, his weathered face thoughtful, his eyes showing a mix of professional respect and curiosity. "Why don't you walk me through what happened, Mr. Reeves? Start from the beginning." Garrett gave him the facts, just the facts. No embellishment, no emotion, no dramatization, just a clear chronological account of what he'd witnessed and what he'd done, delivered in the flat, professional tone of a man giving an after-action report to a commanding officer. He mentioned the knife, the gun, the attempted kidnapping, the use of necessary force to protect an innocent life. He detailed the tactical decisions he'd made, the way he'd approached, the commands he'd given his dog, the strikes he'd delivered, all of it presented as objective reality without judgment or pride. As he spoke, paramedics arrived and began treating Claire for shock and minor injuries, checking her vitals, cleaning the wounds on her wrists, wrapping her in a blanket despite the heat because shock made people cold. She kept one hand on Bailey's collar the entire time, refusing to let him go, her fingers twisted in his fur like a lifeline. Another paramedic approached Tank Top, who was now complaining loudly about his arm, demanding pain medication, threatening lawsuits, the bluster of a criminal who knew he was caught but was trying to maintain some illusion of control. When Garrett finished his account, Ortiz was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. He pulled out a small notebook and jotted down a few notes, then looked up at Garrett with an expression that was hard to read. "That was a hell of a thing you did, Mr. Reeves. Anyone would have done it," Garrett said, and he meant it, genuinely believed that any decent person would have intervened, would have helped, would have protected the defenseless. "No," Ortiz said firmly, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "They wouldn't. I've been doing this job for 32 years. I've seen hundreds of crimes in progress, and 99% of the time, people look away. They drive away. They tell themselves it's not their problem. They call 911 if they're feeling particularly civic-minded, and then they leave before they have to get involved. Most people would have driven past that van without even slowing down, or called us and hoped we got here in time. He shook his head. You stepped in. You put yourself between a woman and men with weapons. That's not anyone. That's someone who's been trained to run toward danger when every instinct says to run away. Garrett said nothing. What was there to say? Ortiz was right, but it didn't feel heroic. It felt like the only possible response to what he'd witnessed. Walking away would have been the aberration, the failure, the thing he couldn't have lived with. Ortiz glanced at the two men being loaded into ambulances under deputy supervision, both handcuffed to the gurneys, both under arrest. His jaw tightened, and something dark and angry flashed in his eyes. Those two are Jason Keller and Marcus Voss. We've been looking for them for 3 days. They're part of a trafficking ring operating out of Phoenix, running victims to the Mexican border. We think they've taken at least 4 other women in the last 2 months. His voice dropped lower, became harder. We haven't found the others yet. We don't know if they're still alive. The words hit Garrett like a physical blow, like a punch to the solar plexus that drove the air from his lungs and made his chest tight. 4 other women. 4 families destroyed. 4 lives stolen, probably ended in some nightmare that he didn't want to imagine, but could imagine all too clearly because he'd seen the worst of what humans could do to each other. And Claire would have been the 5th victim, would have joined that terrible roll call, would have become another name on a missing persons report that slowly went cold as the leads dried up and the case file gathered dust. She got lucky you were here, Ortiz said quietly, his eyes meeting Garrett's with the understanding of one man who'd seen darkness recognizing another. No, Garrett said, looking across the parking lot at Claire, who was now standing with a blanket around her shoulders despite the desert heat, Bailey pressed against her legs, both of them surrounded by paramedics and deputies, both of them alive and breathing and here. She fought. She didn't give up. She kept struggling even when they had her bound, even when they had weapons, even when it looked hopeless. That's why she's alive. She saved herself. I just gave her an opening. Ortiz studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes assessing, and Garrett had the sense of being evaluated by someone who understood what it meant to serve, to protect, to carry the weight of lives saved and lives lost. "You're a good man, Mr. Reeves," the sergeant said finally. "The world needs more like you, a hell of a lot more." Garrett didn't feel like a good man. He felt tired. He felt old. He felt like a hammer that had been used so many times it didn't know how to be anything else, like a tool that kept getting pulled out of retirement because the world kept needing what it was built for. But as he watched Claire bend down and wrap her arms around Bailey, as he saw the pure, unfiltered relief and love in that embrace, as he witnessed the moment of 2 beings who had faced death together and come through to the other side, something tight and cold in his chest, something that had been locked down since the last mission, since he'd come home loosened just a little. Maybe this was what peace looked like. Not the absence of war, not the silence of inaction, not the comfortable numbness of turning away, but the presence of something worth protecting, the willingness to act when action was required, the choice to step forward when others stepped back. Maybe peace wasn't something you found. Maybe it was something you built, one intervention at a time, one life saved at a time, one moment of standing between evil and innocence at a time. Over the next hour, the parking lot transformed into a carefully controlled chaos of law enforcement activity. Crime scene tape went up, forming a perimeter around the van and the area where the confrontation had occurred. Evidence markers were placed yellow plastic numbered tents, marking the locations where weapons had fallen, where blood had been spilled, where the struggle had taken place. Garrett gave his full statement 3 times, once to Sergeant Ortiz with a digital voice recorder capturing every word, once to a detective who arrived from the trafficking task force and wanted to understand the tactical timeline, and once more for the official video statement that would be used in court, standing in front of a camera and recounting the events with clinical precision, never embellishing, never dramatizing, just stating the facts as they had occurred. Each time he kept his answers precise and factual, never embellishing, never dramatizing. He described the suspects' positions, their weapons, their statements, his assessment of the threat, his tactical decisions, the use of force, and the outcome. He detailed Maverick's training and capabilities, explaining why a military working dog's intervention was appropriate force against an armed suspect pointing a firearm. He provided his concealed carry permit, his military discharge papers, and Maverick's service records and retirement documentation, all of which he kept in a folder in his truck, because preparation prevented problems. Maverick sat beside him through it all, a silent, steady presence that drew curious looks from every law enforcement officer who passed. Several of them stopped to ask about him, to hear his story, to learn about his service. One young deputy, fresh-faced and earnest, asked if he could take a photo with the hero dog. Garrett agreed, and watched as Maverick tolerated the attention with professional patience, his tail giving a few polite wags, his eyes constantly returning to Garrett to confirm this was acceptable. Finally, as the sun finished setting and the desert sky turned a deep purple studded with emerging stars, as the temperature began to drop and the air took on the crystalline quality of desert nights, Ortiz approached Garrett one last time. "You're free to go, Mr. Reeves. We have everything we need. You'll probably be called to testify when this goes to trial, but that won't be for months. Maybe a year, depending on if they take a plea deal." He paused, then added, "They'd be smart to take the deal. With your testimony and the physical evidence and the victim's statement, this is as airtight as cases get." "Understood," Garrett said, feeling the exhaustion starting to creep in now that the adrenaline was fading. His muscles ached. His head hurt. He wanted to drive somewhere quiet, find a motel, and sleep for about 12 hours. "One more thing," Ortiz said. He glanced back at the ambulance where Claire was still being evaluated, where she'd refused transport to the hospital until she could speak with the man who'd saved her life. "She's asking for you. Wants to say thank you before you leave." Garrett hesitated. He'd done his job. The woman was safe. The bad guys were in custody. There was nothing else to do here except leave and continue driving to wherever he'd been heading. Before this all started, he'd honestly forgotten. California, maybe. Or north to Oregon. Somewhere with trees and water and places where the memories didn't follow quite as close. But Maverick nudged his hand with his nose, a gentle reminder that some duties extended beyond tactical necessities, that sometimes people needed closure, needed to look their rescuer in the eye and express gratitude, even if words were inadequate. "Okay," Garrett said. He walked over to the ambulance, his boots crunching on the gravel at the edge of the parking lot. Claire was sitting on the back bumper, Bailey lying at her feet, his head resting on her shoes, neither of them willing to be separated even by the smallest distance. She'd been cleaned up a bit, the dirt washed from her face by the paramedics, her wrists bandaged where the zip ties had cut into her skin, her vital signs checked and rechecked. But her eyes, those were still haunted, still processing the trauma of what had nearly happened, still carrying the shadow of the terror she'd experienced. When she saw Garrett approaching, she stood up quickly, then swayed a little, her balance still affected by shock and adrenaline crash. Garrett reached out instinctively to steady her, his hand on her elbow, but she waved him off gently. "I'm okay," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. She wouldn't be okay for a long time. But she was alive, and that was what mattered. Just a little shaky still. "That's normal," Garrett said, his voice gentle. "The adrenaline dump. Your body's been running on survival mode for hours. It'll take a while to wear off completely. You'll probably crash hard in a few hours, sleep like the dead. That's normal too. Don't fight it." She looked at him, really looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to memorize every detail. "The detective told me who you are. He said you're a Navy SEAL. Retired." "Was?" Garrett corrected gently, automatically. "The teams were something you never truly left, but the formal affiliation ended when the paperwork was signed. But you still." She gestured vaguely at the scene around them, at the evidence markers and the police tape and the empty spot where the suspects had been. "You still did this. You didn't have to. You could have driven away. You could have just called the police and waited. Most people would have. I couldn't," Garrett said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You needed help. Your dog needed help. That's all that mattered." Tears welled up in her eyes again, threatening to spill over. "They were going to kill me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "And Bailey." "I know they were. The one with the tattoos, Marcus," he kept saying. Her voice broke completely. He kept saying they'd get rid of us once they were far enough out in the desert. That they had a spot where no one would ever find us. That I should just accept it and make it easier on myself. Garrett's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping, but he kept his voice calm and steady. "They didn't. You're here. You're safe. And they're going to prison for a very, very long time. Because of you," she said fiercely, her voice stronger now, carrying conviction. She looked down at Maverick, who was sitting at Garrett's side, his amber eyes watching her with gentle intelligence, his presence radiating that same calm strength his partner carried. And him. "I've never seen a dog move like that. He knew. He knew I needed help. He knew Bailey needed help." "He's a good judge of character," Garrett said, a hint of warmth entering his voice, the first real emotion he'd shown since the incident had started. "And he doesn't like bullies. Never has. It's what made him perfect for the teams." Claire knelt down, moving slowly and carefully, her muscles still tight and sore, and extended her hand toward Maverick in the universal gesture of greeting. "May I, Maverick?" Garrett said, his voice carrying the release command. "Friend." Maverick's posture relaxed immediately, his tail beginning to wag in gentle sweeps, and he leaned forward, sniffing Claire's hand with his wet nose. She scratched behind his ears, her fingers working through his fur, and his tail wagged harder, his eyes closing in simple pleasure. "Thank you, Maverick," she whispered to the dog, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for saving Bailey. You're the best boy. You're such a good boy." Bailey, not wanting to be left out of the moment, pushed his golden head under her other hand, and she laughed a shaky, tearful sound, but a genuine laugh nonetheless. The first hint that maybe, eventually, she would be able to find joy again despite the trauma. She petted both dogs with trembling hands, her face pressed between them, and for a moment the three of them formed a tableau of survival and gratitude. "They're both heroes," she said, looking up at Garrett, her eyes shining with tears. "Both of you, you and Maverick, you saved our lives." "Just doing what needed to be done," Garrett said. Shifting uncomfortably, unused to gratitude, unused to being the center of attention, uncomfortable with the label of hero, because heroes were the guys who didn't come home, who threw themselves on grenades, who gave everything. He'd just done his job. Claire stood up slowly, using the ambulance bumper for support. "I don't know how to thank you. I don't have the words for what this means. What you did." "You don't need to thank me," Garrett said, meeting her eyes with quiet intensity. Just He paused, searching for the right words, the words that would help her, that would give her something to hold on to. Just keep living. Keep walking your dog. Keep doing whatever it was you were doing before this happened. Don't let them take that from you. Don't let them win by making you afraid to live your life. She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but there was something stronger in her expression now. Some spark of determination that hadn't been there before. I'll try. I promise. I'll try. A female deputy approached, touching Claire's shoulder gently. Miss Morrison, we need to get you to the hospital for a full evaluation. It's standard procedure after an assault. Your family is meeting us there. We contacted them, and they're on their way. Claire nodded, then turned back to Garrett one more time. Will I see you again? At the trial? Probably, Garrett said. The district attorney will need both of our testimonies. It might be months from now, but yes. Good, she said firmly, reaching out to squeeze his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who'd been through what she'd experienced. Good. I want to see you again. I want to thank you properly when I'm not, when I'm more myself. She climbed into the ambulance with Bailey. The paramedics had agreed to let the dog ride with her after seeing how distressed she became when they tried to separate them, and the doors closed. Garrett watched it pull away, its lights flashing but sirens silent, carrying a woman who would have nightmares for years, who would probably need therapy and medication and support, but who was alive to have nightmares, alive to heal, alive to walk her dog and see sunrises, and maybe, eventually, find peace. Mr. Reeves, Sergeant Ortiz called from across the parking lot. You're good to go. Drive safe. Garrett nodded. He walked back to his truck, Maverick trotting beside him, their shadows long in the parking lot lights. The lot was nearly empty now, just a few pieces of yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the desert breeze and some tire marks on the asphalt that would fade with the next rain. He opened the truck door. Maverick jumped in, settling into his spot in the passenger seat with a satisfied grunt. Garrett climbed in after him, started the engine, and sat there for a moment, his hands on the wheel, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and the soft sounds of the desert night. "What do you think, boy?" he asked quietly, looking at his partner. "Did we do good?" Maverick looked at him, his amber eyes warm and steady and full of that simple, uncomplicated love that only dogs can give, and gave a single soft chuff that seemed to say everything that needed to be said. Garrett managed a small smile, the first genuine smile that had touched his face in weeks. "Yeah, I think so too." He pulled out of the gas station, parking lot, and merged back onto the interstate, heading west toward the setting sun, toward California, toward whatever came next. The highway stretched out before him in the gathering darkness, endless and open, and Garrett drove with Maverick beside him, two warriors who had found, if not peace, then at least purpose. But for the first time in 3 weeks, maybe for the first time since he'd left the teams, since he'd signed those discharge papers, since he'd driven away from the only life he'd known for more than 2 decades, he didn't feel like he was running anymore. He felt like he'd found something, a purpose, a reason, a mission that didn't require orders or permission or official sanction. The highway stretched out before him, endless and open, full of possibility, and Garrett drove into the gathering darkness with Maverick beside him. Two warriors who had learned that peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of something worth protecting. 3 days later, Garrett was sitting in a diner in Flagstaff, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone from hot to lukewarm while he stared out the window, watching people walk past on the sidewalk, living their normal lives, completely unaware of the darkness that moved in the shadows of their world. He was reading the local paper, the Arizona Republic, which he'd picked up at a gas station that morning when his phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown number, which usually meant spam or a wrong number, but something made him answer anyway. He answered cautiously. "Reeves. Mr. Reeves, this is Detective Linda Vargas, Phoenix PD, Trafficking Task Force. Do you have a moment?" Her voice was professional but warm, carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been excitement or relief. "Yes, ma'am," Garrett said, sitting up straighter, his attention suddenly focused. "I wanted to give you an update on the Keller and Voss case. Based on information we recovered from their van, some phones, some documents, GPS data, and forensic evidence, we were able to locate the 4 missing women. We executed a warrant on a property outside Tucson early this morning. They're all alive, Mr. Reeves. All 4 of them. We got them out." Garrett's hand tightened on the phone, his knuckles going white. "All of them?" His voice was rough with emotion he couldn't quite contain. "All of them," Vargas confirmed, and now he could definitely hear the emotion in her voice, the relief and satisfaction of a case that had ended well instead of in tragedy. "Thanks to your intervention with Miss Morrison, we got Keller and Voss into custody before they could move or destroy evidence. Keller tried to negotiate a deal. He gave us the location, thinking it would help him. It won't, but it helped us. You saved 5 lives, Mr. Reeves, 5 women who are going home to their families tonight. I wanted you to know that. I thought you deserved to know that what you did mattered, that it made a difference." Garrett was silent for a long moment, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He looked out the diner window at the street beyond, at people walking past, at a mother pushing a stroller, at a couple holding hands, at an old man walking his dog, all of them living their lives, blissfully unaware of how fragile and precious those lives were, how quickly they could be stolen, how much evil existed in the world, and how few people stood between that evil and the innocent. "Thank you for telling me, Detective," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for that." "No, Mr. Reeves, thank you. Thank you for being the kind of man who doesn't look away. Thank you for not being one of the people who tells themselves it's not their problem. Not many people would have done what you did. Most people would have driven away, would have called us, and hoped we got there in time. But you stepped in. You put yourself at risk to save a stranger. That takes a special kind of courage. Anyone should have," Garrett said quietly, believing it, wishing it were true. "But you did," Vargas said, her voice firm. "That matters. That's what makes the difference. The ones who act instead of hoping someone else will. You saved 5 lives. 5 families get their daughters back, their sisters, their mothers. You did that. I wanted you to know." She hung up. Garrett set his phone down on the table and stared at it, his mind processing the information, his heart doing things he'd thought it had forgotten how to do. Across the booth from him, Maverick was lying on the seat, his head resting on his paws, watching Garrett with those knowing amber eyes that had seen everything Garrett had seen, that understood on some level what this moment meant. 5, Garrett said softly, the word hanging in the air of the diner like a prayer. 5 women, Mav. 5 lives. Maverick's tail thumped once against the vinyl seat, a sound of acknowledgement and agreement. Garrett reached across and scratched the dog's ears, his fingers working through the soft fur. "Good boy," he murmured. "Good boy. We did it, buddy. We actually did it." For the first time since he'd left the service, since he'd driven away from the only life he'd known, since he'd started this aimless journey across the country looking for something he couldn't name, Garrett Reeves felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he still had work to do. Not in the teams. Not in some godforsaken desert halfway around the world where the rules of engagement were clear and the enemy wore uniforms and the mission parameters were defined. But here, in gas station parking lots and forgotten stretches of highway and small-town diners where evil tried to operate in the shadows, wherever the mission found him, because evil didn't retire. It didn't take leave. It didn't sign discharge papers and drive away into civilian life. It kept working, kept hurting, kept destroying every single day. And neither did the warriors who stood against it. 6 weeks after the incident at the desert stop, Garrett received a package in the mail. It was addressed to him care of the VA hospital, where he'd been receiving his counseling sessions, the twice-weekly appointments with Dr. Sarah Chen, who was trying to help him process his trauma, his survivor's guilt, his adjustment to civilian life. Inside was a handwritten letter on nice stationery and a photograph in a frame. The photo showed Claire Morrison standing in a sunny park, Bailey sitting beside her, both of them smiling at the camera with genuine joy. Claire looked healthy, her face bright with life and hope instead of terror. She wore a volunteer vest with the words "Crisis Advocate" printed across it. Bailey wore a service dog vest. Across the bottom of the photo frame, someone had engraved in elegant script, "Because of you, we get to see another sunrise." The letter was written in neat cursive on matching stationery. "Dear Garrett and Maverick, I wanted to send you this to let you know we're okay. Better than okay, actually. I've started training to become a victim advocate, working with survivors of trafficking and assault through the Maricopa County Crisis Center. Bailey and I do visits to police stations now, helping comfort other survivors, helping them see that there's life after trauma. We're turning what happened to us into something good. We're making sure your actions, your courage ripples outward to help even more people. The nightmares are getting better. I'm in therapy twice a week, and Dr. Martinez says I'm making good progress. Some days are hard. Some days I can't leave the house. But most days, I can walk Bailey again. I can go to the park. I can live. I think about you both every day. You didn't just save my life, you showed me what courage looks like, what protection looks like, what good men and good dogs can do when they choose to stand up instead of turning away. You showed me that. There are still heroes in the world, that not everyone ignores evil when they see it. The trial is scheduled for 3 months from now. Keller and Voss are both pleading guilty. Their lawyers told them they had no chance with our testimonies and the physical evidence. Because of what you did, they'll spend the rest of their lives in prison. Because of what you did, 4 other women are alive and home with their families. Because of what you did, a trafficking ring was destroyed and dozens of potential future victims were saved. You said I didn't need to thank you, but I do anyway. Thank you for seeing. Thank you for acting. Thank you for being exactly who you are. I know you're out there somewhere, still driving, still wandering. I hope you've found some peace. You deserve it more than anyone I've ever met. You've earned it. With every scar, every sacrifice, every moment you chose to protect instead of ignore. With eternal gratitude and respect, Claire and Bailey P.S. Bailey wants you to know that Maverick is his hero. Mine too. Garrett read the letter 3 times, sitting in his truck in a rest stop somewhere in Montana. The big sky country spread out around him like something from a painting. Maverick asleep beside him, with his head resting on Garrett's thigh. His hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. His vision blurred with tears he didn't try to hide because there was no one there to see them, no one to maintain appearances for. 5 women, 5 families whole again. Dozens more saved because a trafficking ring had been destroyed. All because he'd been in the right place at the right time and had chosen to act instead of turning away. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what peace looked like. Then he folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his glove box next to Claire's photo, and pulled back onto the highway. There was more road ahead. More gas stations, more chances to be in the right place at the right time, more opportunities to do what he'd been trained to do, what he'd been built to do, what he would always do when evil showed its face. And Garrett Reeves, retired Navy SEAL, wanderer, protector, was ready for whatever came next. Because the mission never really ended, it just found new forms, and there would always be people who needed protecting, always. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes still exist. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments, what was your favorite moment? Was it the K-9's loyalty, the SEAL's protection, or the moment justice was served? We read every comment. God bless, and see you in the next story.